Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Reality Seeker Presents podcast. My name is Ryan Chrisman, and I am joined today by Kathy Allen, a Ph.D. who is an expert on organizational leadership. I asked her if I could ask her some questions about community development, since Reality Seeker is moving toward the study of community development in its community-based philosophical discussion groups. So I'll begin with where Kathy introduced herself during our Zoom call.
My name is Kathleen Allen, and I have a doctorate in leadership, and I've worked in for-profit and a lot of nonprofit and volunteer associations for over 20 years, helping them think about how they bring leadership and organizational or systems change together. So I've written a book called Leading from the Roots, Nature-Inspired Leadership Lessons, where I use nature to help me understand the best way to design conversations or initiatives that have the highest possible chance of creating a better world.
Okay, I'll put a link to your book in when I.
Thanks.
Okay, so the first question is, what are the benefits of individuals participating in collaborative community development groups?
This is one of the beautiful things about being a living systems. So all human beings are living systems. You know, we have a heartbeat, we breathe, we have circulation flowing through our brains. But one of the things in our bodies, that we as a living system understand and nature understands is that when we come together and learn by gaining more information, we evolve as human beings. So one of the best and highest possibilities of individuals participating in a community development group is that they will be put into a relationship with people that they may or may not know, and that with a deliberate intent to learn individually and collectively, we all evolve together. And so the biggest outcome would be as we individually learn, we collectively learn, and we create a better community as a result of our conversations.
Okay.
There's a beautiful framework that talks about the power of conversation, and that when you bring people together to have conversation, what we talk about matters. And then we take those important conversations and we share them with people we know. And so that's one of the ways change happens in our lives and in the lives of others.
Okay. Question number 2, how should a grassroots community development group get started? What are the first steps?
So if you're an individual and you have something that you want to learn more about in a deliberate and intentional way, the first thing you would do would be to name that for yourself. So what is it that you are interested in? And then the second step would be go down your networks and friendships and see who else might be interested in taking this journey with you. There's John McKnight created this thing called asset-based community development. And he always believes that there are signs of people who are predisposed to connecting up with each other and doing something better for a community. And so he would say that associations, people that are connected to associations, whether it's the Little League or a vets group or a chamber of commerce or any kind of nonprofit association, those people have already decided that they want to come together and learn and do something for the community. And so they're folks who are connected to those networks or associations are very easy to invite into a bigger conversation, either about the larger community or an aspect of the community. So you could either do it through friendships, through networks, through affinity interests. So I volunteer for an international leadership association group, and they people who become members identify interest areas, and So we gather people who have common interest, and then we begin these kind of peer conversations to see if we can't do something to leverage these interests to something more important and beneficial for our community.
Okay. Question number 3 is, in what ways should a successful community development reflect the lessons of nature?
Here are a couple of ways. One is that nature has a very strong common purpose. The purpose of nature, if it were able to speak for itself, would be nature is designed to create conditions conducive to the life of future generations. So every part of their design is designed that way. And that powerful common purpose is strengthened when we apply 2 more of nature's designs, which is we bank on diversity and we reward cooperation. So when nature has 3 kinds of evolutionary stages in its ecological system. One is kind of a very less evolved, lots of weeds and annuals. They don't live long. They take their resources from the ground, and they spread by seeds and things like this from season to season. They do have a purpose, though, which is to build up the soil. And as they build up the soil, eventually new life with more diversity comes in. And we have perennials and shrubs and short-lived trees. And with that greater diversity, they begin to store nutrients from the soil into their root structure. But the third place, which is where your peer collaborative, cooperative community development groups hang out, is the third stage. And the third stage is considered a generous system. And it's because as diversity increases, the species in a stage 3 ecology start to share their resources with each other. So one species has a resource in abundance that another species needs, and vice versa. And they create these mutualistic relationships. And they create this highly resilient, highly diverse, highly cooperative, highly generous system. And that's where you get your old growth and your mature coral reefs and your mature prairies. They all come out of that design. So if you have a tornado hitting down in Nebraska, for example, it won't destroy the whole monocrop of soybeans or corn, because in a prairie it has lots of different root systems and plants, and so it might wipe out that particular set of roots for a period of time, but there's always another kind of set of things blossoming behind it. And so so nature can teach us that the more we get a diversity of perspective in our groups, our peer-to-peer groups, the more we actively cooperate and are trusting and trustworthy in what we share with those groups, the clearer we are about our common purpose of what we're trying to do. Those are all elements that create strong, generous contributions that help us evolve individually and help us evolve collectively.
Okay. What are reasonable outcomes to expect from participation in community development? And should participants guard against having an outcome focus versus the flow of being process oriented?
Well, I think the outcome for a peer-to-peer group matters, but it may not develop right away. Sometimes they're loosely organized, and then as they spend more time with each other, they become a little more concrete and a little more clear about what they want to accomplish. So reasonable outcomes could be either individuals learn and are transformed on an individual level. And then if that happens, that might be just as good as what you want to have, depending on what the group was formed to do in the first place. But if you can transform individuals in a group, you can often transform the collection of individuals in the group. And when you do that, you can also create a big transformation in the community that you're in. So it could go anywhere from an individual change to a larger community change. That's what the power of peer-to-peer groups can do. In terms of process and outcomes, I think the direction that we're trying to do is probably optimize both and, not either or. So if you have only process, but no outcome, no goal to get to, you can really get lost in the process. And if you have real strong focus on goal, you can disrupt the process that is important to build trust and get people to share what they're really thinking. So you really need both and. You need to have the tension between some kind of intentional direction and good process, not bad process, but good process.
Can you give an example of a successful peer-to-peer community development effort?
Yes. I have worked with these kind of cooperative networks in a variety of places, one in Tahoe, another in northern Minnesota. I've done a lot of work in rural Nebraska, doing work there as well. So I'll give you an example of what happened in Nebraska. So about 8 years ago, I was asked to come in and help design and facilitate peer learning groups, which was their term in their system, but it's very similar to what you're talking about, to help them over a 4-year process to raise $750,000 in unrestricted endowment for their community funds. So these 4 communities came together. We met twice a year with other things in between for 4 years to help them kind of build their capacity, their knowledge, their learning. And in these peer groups, they had peer groups within their community of people who are committed to accomplishing this goal. And then these 4 different peer groups came together, and they started sharing their learning and their knowledge with each other. So pretty soon we had a very strong, larger 4 community peer group, as well as the individual community peer group, all of them organized around making their communities better. And over time, the power of that has lasted, and this is 8 years on. Those people who were in those peer groups became mentors for the next round of people who were trying to raise money, and the following round. They became mentors from community to community. They became folks who would come to the peer learning trainings and teach them about their experiences and what they've learned and what their wisdom was. And so now, 8 years later, this network that used to be driven by a large community foundation is now filled with talent, filled with expertise, filled with knowledge, and filled with success. And so all of these small rural communities that struggle to thrive, all the people that these people have touched and the communities they've touched have made a significant difference. Another simple example was in northern Minnesota. There was a county collaborative that got together, and they brought together the school system and all the nonprofits in town. And what they wanted to do was to create a stronger community so that nobody in their community would get lost. And because they started with the assumption that if people aren't connected, they are more vulnerable to behavior that hurts them over time. So they wanted to make sure nobody fell through their cracks. And so the school systems and all of these nonprofits, and they all came together to talk about how they could do it better. I was involved with a group of peer community development people in Northern California, and they had come together to try to figure out how to solve complex health issues in their communities. And so you had one county in had decided to become a learning these were all, they were being given some like $5,000 to learn for a year. And what we discovered with this one county, for example, they also didn't want kids to fall through the cracks. And so they started talking to each other and trying to figure out, well, why do the cracks exist and what can we do? And over the year that they talked to each other, they fundamentally changed the system because they brought relationships and trust between them. And then when somebody called and said, I'm worried about so-and-so, that person put down their busy calendar and went to figure out what's happening in that situation and how they could respond best. So it's very powerful, this idea of a community development cooperative group that talks and learns things and can create a better system as a result.
Okay. What is the role of leadership in community development? Are group formats with a strong leader versus a servant leader more effective, or some other approach?
I would say that the approach that's worked best in my observation has been what I would call distributive leadership. So there's not just one leader, but there's multiple leaders that come in and out of leadership. Everybody, leadership is not a zero-sum game. Responsibility isn't a zero-sum game. So when you have people in your group who are all responsible and willing to show up with as much responsibility as they can bring to the group, then they help form the group. They help form the way people engage. They help form how we accomplish things. And that is the strongest, most resilient process. The times when there's been kind of a facilitator of this, one of the critical things that's important in these facilitators is that they have to believe that having these conversations to learn together is important and will lead to something better. And if the facilitator doesn't agree with that or doesn't believe that, the group never really completely evolves. So it's almost like the leader has to hold the highest good possibility for good until the group believes it themselves. And as soon as the rest of the group step in and can believe it themselves, then everybody is actively leaning into the group and trying to make it better. That's what distributive leadership is.
Okay. Last question. Are elements used in effective support groups also used in establishing peer-to-peer cohesion in a group that wishes to focus on action? Is there any conflict between the two modes of operating?
There can be. So in a support group, the facilitator holds themselves oftentimes separate from the members of the group. And they are there to facilitate a conversation. And the conversation that they're trying to facilitate has a specific end in mind. Like perhaps if it might be to strengthen the mental health or the resilience of members of a group, for example. Or it might be to have a conversation about individual resilience or adaptation. It doesn't really matter what the topic is. But that holding yourself separate from is kind of part of usually a traditional support group. But these peer-to-peer community development groups, the facilitator, if there is a facilitator, the role of the facilitator is to hold a container for the conversation. And they are part of the conversation. They are not apart from the conversation. And as a result, they evolve with the group. They listen to the group. They don't have a preconceived notion of what it looks like or what it doesn't look like. They are much more adaptive and open to how the group continues to evolve and changing the way they support that if there's kind of an individual person that is kind of holding the center for that collaborative peer-to-peer group. And eventually you want to get strong distributive leadership through the group. And that would be the other thing, is that in a support group, oftentimes they're not interested in building a succession plan of who might next be in the group that could lead this group, because there's often credentials associated with people who facilitate support groups. But in a peer-to-peer community development group, a collaboration, what you're trying to do is you're looking at your equitableness or reciprocity between all members of the group. And anybody can do this and do this well if they're paying attention. And then they evolve with the group. So I see it as the two groups in the peer-to-peer cohesion is built when the experience of the conversation becomes mutually rewarding with each other. And so the leader holds the container for those great conversations to happen. And over time, there's always tension that show up. So the tension is that they want somebody or some group of people in that peer network want to step up and have a bigger impact or have a more focused kind of outcome or intention of our conversation. And when that happens, then the group resets itself and orients towards that specific outcome and figures out, okay, now how do we do this? How do we move forward? So these cooperative, collaborative community development groups have stages. So they might start out with an informal conversation with each other. And over time, there might be a conversation, okay, this is great, but now what do we want to do? And so then it kind of reorganizes itself around something that they want to do, and you change what you talk about. You might even change who else you bring into the group to have that conversation. And then you get much more focused on what do you want to do? What's the action? What's the outcome? What's the difference we want to make as a result of sharing these things with each other over time?
Okay.
Thank you for listening, everyone. That concludes our podcast. If you would like to participate in our ongoing discussions, please contact me at realityseeker3@gmail.com. Have a nice day.